Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Open Source in Business, a speaker series where we explore a diversity of ways that open source has an impact on the business world and the impact, the economic and business consequences of open source. And today I have the great pleasure of being joined by Dr. Charles Severance, who's clinical professor at the University of Michigan, better known as Dr. Chuck on Twitter and around the Sakai world. And we're going to talk about Sakai in general, the origin story of Sakai, the early days. How should I address you, Chuck? Dr. Chuck?
Yes, that all works. That all works just fine.
Let me first say that the reason why I heard about this story is because I read your book, Sakai Freeze and Freedom, which has been renamed, I noticed, as Sakai Building an Open Source Community. Just out of curiosity, why was the book renamed?
Oh, that's a good question. I was in my office and I had all the early drafts of it. Partly the reason it was renamed was when I wrote the very first draft of it, I was in a bad mood. I was grumpy. And by the time I got done writing it, I realized that I didn't need to be grumpy, and I was sort of unnecessarily grumpy, and I'd gone through it really caused a forced reflection to write the book. And I realized, okay, there was reasons for a lot of things that happened that made me upset at the time. And so I renamed the book. So the first name was kind of like, power to the people, fight, fight, fight. And then the second name was, we did something, we accomplished something, warts and all.
So it's an incredibly readable book. It's a diary style. I mean, you wrote it, so you know this, but for the audience, it's diary style. It kind of chronicles everything from really the early days, 2000, 1999, right through to you leaving the Sakai board in 2006, yep. I think.
Spoiler alert, you don't tell them whether I was fired or quit. Just they've got to read the book and find out if I was fired or not.
And leaving the board is I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
But I'm really interested because one of the things that we talked about just before we came live is that period, 2002, 2003, 2004, there was really an explosion of projects in the education space that were all coming from universities. I wonder, can you give me an idea of like first why that happened and how you got involved?
Yeah, it was a glorious time. It was a good time to be alive. It was a good time to be in higher education. The key was funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation historically has funded libraries and art museums and things like that, because that's what their business model was, right? I mean, not business, but that was their guiding principles. And at one point, they brought in as one of their directors a fellow named Ira Fuchs, who was a former chief information officer at Princeton. And he thought, I will sort of blur my eyes and decide that making higher education better makes humanities better. And I will try to fix some of the problems Ira Fuchs, saw in higher education. And that was that the IT organizations weren't taking the kind of responsibility of managing the explosion of technology, like learning management systems and other things that were going to transform our lives forever, but they were being handed over to commercial companies, increasingly, like Blackboard at the time and WebCT at the time. And so his idea was that we ought to build talent in universities to write software. And if he could then bring together a coalition of universities to build something, they would have commercial grade software and they would control it. And then universities would own their own destiny. And he took the Mellon money and he put that in as bait, in a sense. And so the Sakai project was one of probably 25 projects that the Mellon Foundation funded. And we would every year have like a retreat where all of the Mellon funded projects. David Wiley, who later kind of founded, was one of the founders of the Open Education Resource Movement. A lot of really important people were there at the beginning. They were brought together, not by the fact that they were all funded by the Mellon Foundation. And so they were also creating a community of thinkers, not just a collection of random unconnected projects we were brought together and thought. And so that pretty much was 2000 through 2005, 2006. And Mellon went in a different direction after that. And so what happened was is this nice flow of reward and acknowledgement from a third party kind of vanished at that point, and we were left to our own devices. And Sakai was not the only project that was left to its own devices.
So you mentioned in your book the Open Knowledge Initiative as being one of the early drivers of I
would say that I was both a driver and a disaster at the same time. You know, the biggest, I will just say that probably the first 5 years of my involvement with Sakai was to debunk the idea that the Open Knowledge Initiative had any good ideas. And so the problem was OKI was produced, it was marketed wonderfully, and there was no there. And so what happened is that everyone felt like because OKI existed, it was the interoperability, learning management systems were just a trivially solved problem because OKI hath spoken. And the answer is there is nothing there. I mean, I fought that for a very long time. And organizations like IMS, who do things like learning tools interoperability, they were afraid of OKI because OKI said, we are the alpha in this space. We are the definition of truth in this space. And we will stomp on whoever thinks they know what they're doing. And that would be fine if OKI knew what they were doing, but they didn't. All they were doing is marketing a vacuous idea and doing a very, very good job of it. So in the beginning of Sakai, I had to give lip service to OKI, when in my heart, I knew that my job was to destroy it.
I was not aware of that backstory. That's interesting.
I'm full of backstories. I'm full of lots of things.
So that early explosion of projects was not just in the learning management space, right? There was Koa managing libraries, Kuali managing, campus management, student management, financial software. There was one I was aware of called Cerise, which was French universities collaborating with each other. I don't believe that was a Mellon-funded one.
No, and then there's like OLAT, that's a Swiss thing, that's a learning management system that wasn't Mellon-funded, and Moodle certainly wasn't Mellon-funded. There were other things that were happening in 2004, or 2005, around the world.
It was pretty crazy.
It was. It was a good time.
So you got some funding, and one of the things that I find really interesting is kind of inflection points in projects. So the launch was an inflection point for Sakai. You went from 0 to 100 pretty quickly.
Exactly.
How did you get like all of those early institutions engaged? Did the software come from software that existed that had been used by the university?
There was this piece of software called Chef at the University of Michigan, and we thought it was really great because we'd been using it with like 4,000 students, and that would be pretty good, right? And we were teaching with it even. And the problem is that we at the University of Michigan and at Stanford and at MIT, we'd all written our own kind of hacked up learning systems, and none of us really had used even Blackboard or WebCT at the time because we were so smart that we could build our own. And so we didn't even know what the core use cases for a learning management system were. And so we had the software, and when we wrote that grant in 2003, and then funded in 2004, I was sure that we were done before we started, meaning that, I could just we had software, we proposed to make software, but I already had software. So this is the perfect grant because it's done before it starts. And little did we know, and that's a lot of what the book is about, little did we know that I and many of my other co-founding schools and people didn't really know too much about learning management systems. We had built software that was interesting and cool, but it wasn't scalable. It didn't have the feature set that the commercial folks did. But we didn't even know that. And the people who we said we knew what we were doing. We said we were geniuses. And if you take MIT, Michigan, and Stanford, and they're pretty smart folks, right? And they say they know what they're doing. And so that ought to count for something, but we didn't know what we were doing. And so everyone sort of was drawn into the idea. And And during that time, we were like, by October 2004, we were on the lips of everybody because Blackboard and WebCT had both made some really bad moves. They had been moving from their basic editions, Campus Edition, to the WebCT Vista and Blackboard BB Learn. And that was a rough transition, really rough transition for both those companies. And so the companies were not in a position where they were making their customers very. There was no commercial learning management system in 2004 that really was making its customers happy. And so
that was where like Sakai and Moodle had their opportunity.
Sakai and Moodle around 2004, we walked into a situation where everybody hated their current vendor, or they were writing their own, because there were no real good vendors out there. And so Sakai got a lot of attention because everybody was ready to switch to anything. And here are these schools that are saying, we're going to do this and we're awesome and we know what we're doing. And two of those things were right. The one about we knew what we were doing, that was not so right. Now, by the end of 2006, we did know what we were doing. And by the end of 2006, we had learned a lot. And certainly by 2007, 3 years in. And in some ways, we can laugh at our hubris for stepping into a ring where we had never thrown a punch, right? But sometimes that is what gets you in the game. And that's just table stakes. And then you got to fight your way out of the mess that you created for yourself. And by 2007, we were a very talented group of people, and we really knew what was going on, and we really were working well together. And ultimately, that's what led to me leaving the project for a while. And that was the fact that as a leader, I am better when things are not going well. I'm very good at projects in crisis and digging things out of crises. And I'm proud of what I did. But at some point we woke up and we actually had good software and we weren't in a crisis anymore. And then second order effects started to come in, and the fact that I wasn't as polite to certain people as I probably should have been turned out to matter. But when we were 3 months away from complete and total abject failure, and I was the solution to that problem, then people would tolerate, as one of my dear friends says, I'm an acquired taste. I mean, I over a long career, I've acquired a particular set of skills that are very useful when you need to write something in a hurry, but skills that piss people off when I tell you that you're wrong and you're wrong. And so, I mean, I didn't have time to suffer fools, and we had plenty of fools in our project.
I thought you were doing your Liam Neeson.
I am doing my Liam Neeson. I bring the Liam Neeson quote in every time I can.
So one of the things I love about projects that come out of user communities, as opposed to people who are using them, as opposed to people who feel like they're building something that other people should use, is that you're using it. So you bump off all of the sharp angles all of the time. All of your user community and developer community experiences are based on actually getting that live feedback. How valuable was that in the early days of the project?
It was, well, in the first part, all we knew was what we didn't have. And so all we found out was a long inventory list of what we didn't have. But once we solved kind of that first thing, which took us about 3 years, it was my greatest joy to be a faculty member at the University of Michigan and have commit rights on the software that I was using on a daily basis as a learning management system. I mean, it would take me a year to write a feature and get it in production, but I could round off the rough edges, at least in the parts that I used, and so it's amazing. And my university now uses a private equity-owned, sluggish, boring, non-changing learning management system, and I just found a feature that just set my hair on fire of this learning management system, and I just wanted to shake somebody. Had it been Sakai, I would have just gone and fixed the damn thing if it was as broken as this cloud-based LMS that we're not currently using. Yeah. And I might have had to wait, but in a semester or two, the damn thing would have been fixed, right? Yeah. And so these are those rough edges that at some point, when you get furious at something, you can go get it fixed. And the other thing that's cool about Sakai is we have meetings, and just random faculty show up to these meetings, and there's a bunch of developers and the project managers and the QA people and the UI people, and then a teacher will just start complaining. We'll be like, let's listen for a while, right? We don't always do exactly what they say, but there is no other environment other than Sakai where a faculty member can stumble in to the most core development meeting that's going on once a week on Tuesday mornings at 10 o'clock and just complain about the product and have 10, 15 developers going, you have a point there. I mean, you can't do that in any of the vendors at this point. If you don't like the product,
that's the core value of open source, is the connection that you have between users and developers. And
now, on the other hand, we probably one too many times have listened to a faculty member who said, I need 2 more checkboxes where there's 1 checkbox. That needs to be 3 checkboxes. And then people go, your product's too complex. And then when you try to take out those 2 checkboxes, then 1 out of 400 people say, oh, you ruined it for me. And so it leads to a complexity, and we don't have as good a way to reduce that complexity as I would like. Although we now are a little slower at just adding a feature every time someone shows up with a use case. And the ability to build a tool outside the system with learning tools interoperability takes some of the pressure away that every use case has to be met by this one product with 40 checkboxes, basically.
I used to work on the GNOME project, and a developer called Havoc Pennington wrote a very influential to me essay about a window manager that was introduced in the early days of GNOME 2. And he described kind of a paternalistic approach to building software. Figure out what's broken, and rather than adding an option to unbreak it, make the default better. So it's kind of paternalistic, and certainly GNOME has been criticized, and we've definitely had some of those conversations where, Linus Torvalds was complaining about not being able to switch mouse button options, and so definitely some of the options that we've taken out have angered community members. But it's that constant tension between providing the flexibility and just providing core functionality.
So Dick actually has a really good question, and that is, how do you resolve conflicts on requirements, like how to focus funds? So that took a lot of growth on our part, right? And we spent a lot of time. We spent a lot of time where we would have meetings, and we would take votes, and we would make long spreadsheets, and we would make priorities, kind of like a university would do with, say, a faculty committee that's advising the IT organization. And you'd say, okay, you're going to have 2 FTEs of work that you can allocate, and so where do you want to allocate it? And that didn't work, and that's because the squeakiest wheels always won the argument. If you were loud and lasted long enough, you would drown out everybody else, and you would just vote and vote, and everybody like, man, this meeting's too long, I'll vote for anything, just get me the hell out of this meeting. And then we end up with a bad decision.
Right.
And that was dysfunctional. And so you think that votes and the way you go into a forum and hit the like button or something, and that's how you're going to make decisions, is terrible. It turns out that what we learned was, if people feel strongly enough to write a check, then maybe that's a good idea, right? And so the people who just come in and start yelling with no resources behind them, we don't let that happen anymore. We basically say, show us resources. And the other thing we do is, once someone has an idea and they want to put resources behind it, then we actually try to create a smaller group of people who will throw more resources at the problem and then help guide it so that it doesn't just meet one set of needs. And so we've been pretty fortunate by saying, don't just come into our meetings and yell at us. Come into our meetings and then start writing checks. And, and when people write checks, they think more about what they're trying to do. And when they write checks, then people take a look at what they're trying to do.
Or start writing code.
And we had a really cool example of something that I don't know when you're going to see it from the mainstream vendors, and that is dark mode. And you look at the Blackboard, Xara or Canvas, and then their ability to change their markup to go to dark mode is hard. It was hard for us. And if you'd have asked us to prioritize it, I would say, I'd rather work on session migration, because that is a great performance improver. And I would like to work on this, and I'd like to work on this. LTI feature, not dark mode. But a school, Duke University, said, dark mode's our thing. Leave us alone. You guys go work on all the stuff you want to work on. We're going to work on dark mode. And so in Sakai 21, we have dark mode. Like, wow, you just went off and did dark mode because you were a customer and you just wanted it. And your priorities were different than the rest of our priorities. And the rest of us, we worked on the technical things we felt were important. And then dark mode just appears. And we didn't, and you know, if it was late in delivery, we didn't care. We weren't yelling at them. We're like, so you're playing with dark mode. That's pretty cool. So
pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So Dirk did raise another couple of questions that I also have on my list of things to ask, and that's
those are all great questions, by the way.
Yeah.
Dirk should write a book
about inflection points and hitting inflection points. The funding runs out when you're funded by a foundation. You mentioned that
yes.
the Mellon funding eventually ran out. So the schools that had been getting that funding to work on Sakai had to figure out how to make the project run on its own, either with volunteer effort or commercial support or some other funding model.
Right.
So how do you convince schools that are using free software, open source, that it's actually in their interest to, you know, contribute some money to a common pool so that the development of the software is sustainable?
So these days in Sakai, that's not hard at all. We have schools that just come write $100,000 checks all the time, because the alternative is write $1 million check to a cloud vendor, right? And so they write a $100,000 check this year, and then, you know, their prices are a lot lower. And so we have never had, not recently. So for the past 5 years, we have more money in Sakai than we have developers who can get things done. And so, but that wasn't always the case. There was really three phases of Sakai. We're now in the good phase. The first phase was Mellon funds. The second phase was after Mellon funds. The founding university shouldered an excessive amount of load. And so Stanford, Michigan, Indiana did a lot of work, way more work than they deserve to be asked to do. And they would go to the Sakai conference and you'd have the founding schools at the front of the room, and the adopting schools would be whining at them as if the University of Michigan was their vendor, right? You go whine at the vendor, and the vendor goes, well, maybe I'll do it, maybe I won't. And it got like that. And so it turned out that by 2010 or so, it felt like a terrible liability to have been one of the founding members of Sakai. Once or twice a year, you got yelled at by the customer base for not doing more. And University of Michigan was spending close to $1 million a year on Sakai.
So you were actually spending money on developer salaries.
Oh yeah, it was great. I mean, there was, you were a faculty member, you walked in and we'd say, we got your back. We know what you need. We will get it done. And we will figure it out a way, and we'll change the product, and everyone will benefit. And it was a glorious time, but it wasn't a sustainable time, because being yelled at for spending $1 million is not very fun. So you'll note that all the founding schools went to Canvas in like a 6-month period, right? The moment Canvas kind of broke out, they're like, we're out of here. And it was as much, not because they hated Sakai or Sakai was bad, or they weren't being successful with Sakai. It was the fact that they had been treated badly by the rest of the Sakai community.
And at that point, presumably, they were spending more than they would have spent on Canvas.
They would like to say that, but Canvas is pretty expensive, and I think they're probably spending twice as much on Canvas as they were on Sakai, even though their case at the time was, we're going to save money. It was
but you didn't have the mutualization of the costs across.
Well, it wasn't so much mutualization, because if you did want to just buy Sakai from, say, one of our cloud hosting vendors like Longsight, it's like a quarter of Canvas for the same kind of service. So if all your goal is to save money, Sakai is still way cheaper than Canvas, but that wasn't their point. The Stanford, Indiana, and Michigan, to be associated with Sakai meant being yelled at. And I think that we felt at that time that that was not a bad spend, because we were getting a lot of control. but that spend was then connected to being criticized. And it's pretty hard to spend money and then get criticized for the spending of the money. Thank you for the 950 bugs you fixed this year. Oh, and by the way, I'm pissed because X. And so, but now what we've got is nobody that's in the community right now, other than maybe me, considers themselves a founder. I am the only remaining founder. I'm not a school, I'm a human. And I'm not even the smartest human. And so I just kind of come along and give talks and stuff. And I'm very non-paternalistic, right? I don't put myself above anybody else. And then what happened was, is as soon as those founding schools left, then the other schools sort of rushed in.
Okay.
And places all over the world rushed in. And so now what we have is we have folks that don't feel like they deserve it, but they also don't feel like they're outsiders either. And so the community that we have, as small as it is a wonderful community, and there's very little barrier to participation. There's very little sort of sense of entitlement, and so things go pretty well.
But in those early days, 2004, 2006, you also had a very visible and significant vendor, RSmart, that was involved in the project and was
RSmart and Unicom. But RSmart was the one that was trying to put Sakai into a cardboard box and sell it.
Right. And so because this is one of the things that I found most interesting about your book is that the tensions that existed around that period where a lot of the development work was being done by the schools.
Yep.
And RSmart was commercializing it.
Yep.
And was essentially trying to convince, is my understanding, the Sakai community that the schools that were working on Sakai should make the project better so that they would sell more. And there was some tension between what kind of resources are RSmart bringing to bear on the project versus the benefit that they're hoping to get out of it. Do you want to talk a little bit about those tensions and without,
being too mean?
Without being too mean. I don't want to force you to speak ill of people.
No. You summarize it very well, and that is that RSmart didn't really want to be judged based on their contributions. What they wanted to do was inject themselves in a process that all the work was done over here, and then RSmart was in the middle, and then all the customers were over here, right? And so we were just supposed to be a bunch of hippie creators that just love coding 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then RSmart would take our mess and clean it up. And even schools like, say, Michigan, they wouldn't mind if they would just install the RSmart distribution. Now, there's a model that's like this, right? And you work for that company, right? Where there's like a bunch of hippies over here. There's kind of a packaging thing in the middle. And then there's the people that you encourage to not talk to the hippies directly, but instead work through that packaging company. And so that was the intended model. And if you look at Red Hat, and if you've known Red Hat for long enough, you understand that it's not as simple as Red Hat in that picture, right? I mean, that was the kind of starting model of Red Hat, right? And it was a useful model, but ultimately Red Hat has had to become a philanthropist. Red Hat has had to become a good citizen. It can't be a jerk, and it doesn't get to have exclusive anything. It has to be seen as adding value where it adds value. And so, in 2004, people looked at the Red Hat model and said, I want to be like that, and I'll just be a billionaire the next day, and IBM will buy me. And that's what the idea was. But then they had to, in a sense, cut out anybody going out around them. So we wanted to have commercial affiliates, a diverse population of commercial companies, and we do now. RSmart's not one of them. But RSmart felt like any commercial vendor should have to license the RSmart product. A commercial vendor should not use the Sakai product. They should use the RSmart product because
I wasn't aware of that. So did you had difficulty building an ecosystem of vendors around Sakai because RSmart was attempting to...
No, that's just what they wanted. They were absolutely not allowed to get it, but this is what led to some of the tension in late 2006, early 2007, where I'm like, I mean, the community follows me. If there's any paternalistic symbol, it's me. I don't act paternalistic, but I am a paternalistic symbol. And I was not, they wanted me to like tell everybody to follow this path. And I'm like, I will quit or be fired before I tell an open source community that the solution, it'd be like Linus saying the only way to get Linux is through Red Hat. That's what they want. They wanted me to say the only distribution of Linux is cool, and I'm Linus, and I'm gonna keep making Linus, but the only distribution you should ever use is the Red Hat distribution. And if somehow you go back in time and Red Hat could make that happen and bribe Linux or something, I don't think the world would be as good as it is today. I mean, that doesn't mean the Red Hat doesn't add a lot of value. And this is where it kind of went wrong for Sakai and RSmart, is that RSmart had one way of thinking about it. They just couldn't think about it as, we have to be stewards of everything that we do, and we have to be giving. And so they wanted to take, they wanted exclusive, they wanted to just turn a money crank. And our growth was their growth, and no growth happened outside of them. And it didn't happen. I kicked them out.
So who owns the Sakai mark, the trademark?
The Sakai trademark was owned by the Sakai Foundation, and now is the Apereo Foundation. And so, yeah.
Okay. So it's company owned and company run, and you have kind of a level playing field, trademark guidelines.
Yeah, and you to be a commercial affiliate, you have to join, and we can kick you out if you don't have the right ethics. We have not kicked anybody out, but there have been folks that have had bad ethics and left.
Okay, so Dirk asks if it's a better idea to commercialize the project in the way that Kuali did, and have a single vendor around the project that's a kind of an identifiable vendor for the project, or is it better to try to build this ecosystem of vendors?
So that's really two questions. The first question is, did Kuali do it right? And the answer is absolutely not. Kuali's an unqualified disaster, in my opinion. Everything about it was an unqualified disaster. And if you look at them 10 years later, they have like the exact 7 customers that they had when they were founded. And Kuali Co. was not a wisely conceived idea. Kuali Co. was so that Indiana University could run from responsibility and just leave the bag on the doorstep of Kuali Co. and say, here's all the money, here's all the customers, I'm out, because this is getting actually complex and I don't have the talent to actually do this. I'm just leaving. And so Kuali was just an unqualified disaster. It wasn't right. That's the first question. The second question is, oh, by the way, RSmart was involved in Kuali as well.
I was aware of that.
Yeah. The second question is harder and more subtle and nuanced, and that is, if you were starting today, what role does a commercial company have in an open source project? And could you construct an open source project with one commercial company as the as like a founder, as it were? Like, commercial companies really founded Sakai. 4 universities founded it. And this is something that I think about more and more. And you see things coming out about OpenLMS. You watch Canvas, not as it was intended, but how things are kind of turning out for Canvas. And then you look at things like Elasticsearch, and you scratch your head, and you say to yourself, is Elasticsearch right? And for those who don't know Elasticsearch, I used Elasticsearch for a decade before I really realized that there was a company called Elasticsearch. I thought Elasticsearch was just a bunch of hippies in a GitHub repo. But Elasticsearch is like $1 billion company. I think it might be a Dutch company, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
yeah, it's a Netherlands company. And
it built on Apache Lucene.
Of course, built on Apache Lucene. When Apache is a real hippie open source thing. Although a lot of Apache projects tend to be a small company of 2 or 3 consultants and a piece of software. But those
or
folks
even a bigger company, like what's the there are some of the business process management projects in Apache that have a vendor like Day behind them.
Yeah, Day software is a perfect example, like JSR 170 and Day software, for example, was there. And so that's a pretty solid model. The key to that is I think you would find that most of those companies that you could think of as kind of like the shadow founders of open source projects, they're often European. They're not often American. And that's because European culture doesn't tell every single child the moment they're born and come out of they start crying and say, when are you going to make $1 billion? For every child in America, you got to go after $1 billion. And there's only one good way to make $1 billion, and that's hurt 1 billion people for $1. And you don't make $1 billion by doing good. You make $1 billion by hurting people.
Yeah. And what's the line? Somebody talking about the American taxation system, saying the problem with raising the taxes on the rich in the US is everybody thinks they're a temporarily embarrassed millionaire.
Exactly. They're not rich yet. They're just not rich yet. Yeah. They're not rich yet. And so you'd see that a lot of these companies that are successful supporters of open source and successful founders come from European, where you find small European companies that have 10 to 20 employees are completely satisfied with a really good income, good health benefits, working with people you like, building software you like, and having customers that you like, and realizing that 30 people is all you need to be because you live in the West End of London and you can go to a show anytime you want and get chips at 2 o'clock in the morning. And you don't need $1 billion to be happy, because if you live in the West End of London and go to a pub and get chips and go to a show, you don't need $1 billion to be happy. We're in America. If you don't have $1 billion, you're not happy, damn it. So you better be working on that. And so these kind of founding companies that keep their values intact tend to not get greedy and not get large. Elasticsearch is the interesting exception to that, although it is a European company. It almost could be a country, but it's a European company. And so we see this in this where a high value, high moral value organization can lead an open source project. And I mean, I've been in conversations with Phil Miller, who's a dear friend of mine, who runs OpenLMS, which is the kind of commercialized Moodle thing, and he just went open source. And I'm like, what does that mean, right? Yeah, you're releasing your stuff. It's a GitHub repo, and that doesn't mean anything. The thing that I love about Elasticsearch, and Elasticsearch is probably at this point, in my mind, the closest to a good modern open source, highly sustainable project. And here's the key thing that Elasticsearch did that I don't think I've seen from really any other company, or if I did, I didn't even notice it, and that's what's important. What's important is that Elasticsearch feels like the people who are using their product and not paying for their product are as important of a customer to them as the people who are paying them for the product. So lots of open source, like say Canvas, like they go like, yeah, it's open source, and all we're going to do is try to convert you to a commercial company, a commercial customer, right? And so it's just a trick to get you as a commercial customer. And I would love to meet some of the Elasticsearch people. Like, do you really think in your heart of hearts that, like me as the open source guy who hasn't paid you a single penny for using Elasticsearch for a decade, am I valuable to you? Or am I just a drag that you wish I would pay you money? And I hope, I dream that Elasticsearch really doesn't mind if you pay them or not.
I don't know if I'd hold them up as the exemplar, to be honest.
I wish I knew a better one, and I'm not going to give them an A+, right? But
I mean, it's not at this point. I don't think it is. I don't think we can call Elasticsearch open source anymore after the license change to SSPL.
And that's the problem, right? And the problem is once you become $1 billion company, it's really hard to not sort of push your advantage, right? And so this is where you go back to these 10 to 15 person companies. They tend to stay cool. They don't kind of, and so we have a company in Sakai, and we would be lost without them. Mm-hmm. And they're called Longsight. They're our kind of #1 cloud hoster. They are probably our #1 contributor at this point. But they're only, I don't know how many there are. It's 10, 12 people, but not 250, right?
Okay.
And so what
you need money to sustain it.
And those people are paid well. We're all good friends, and you can't really almost tell where our commercial folks stop and our open source people start. We're all in the same meeting. Nobody like says, well, you're not from my company, so I have to make you fill out a special form before I look at your commit, right? And so I would say, I'm totally unbiased here. I would say that the most perfect open source commercial product relationship, commercial company relationship is Sakai and Longsight. Now, I'm completely unbiased in that. But I study it all the time, and I'm great friends with Sam Otnoff, the founder of Longsight. The interesting thing about Longsight is, unlike Unicon and RSmart, who came in when it was the gold rush, Longsight came in like 2008. And then by then we were an established product, and we weren't sort of like, and they're just like, let's make some money and help put some code in here and fix some bugs. And they did, and they made some money, and they continue to be a great folks, and they don't think that they're better than anybody else. But we really depend on them, and they're really good. And I think that as long as they don't become a billion-dollar company, that relationship will stay. And so if I was to start it right now, going back to the question, I would want a company, but I would somehow want that company not to have as its goal make $1 billion, right? To be a lifestyle company, right. To be a company where the joy is, and so for me, it doesn't have to be a nonprofit. There's lots of for-profit companies that I love working with, because I know that they're small, I know that they're happy, and I know that they don't crave something that they're not. And so if I can trust them, invest in them. Let me just give you a really tiny example. When I started teaching the world's most popular Python program, most popular programming course, Python for Everybody, I told people to use a free text editor called Text Wrangler. And so I just said, hey, download this Text Wrangler, and I'll do all my samples in class in Text Wrangler, because I wanted to open source a free product. Well, I probably took the downloads of Text Wrangler and multiplied them by 50 by the time it was all said and done. But also 2 years later, Text Wrangler was spammy. It installed trackers, and people are like, why are you telling me to download this thing that is just so spammy and full of trackers? And then they stopped with a free one, and they made another thing that was not free. And as soon as you get the free one, it tells you to buy the other one. And here I am to hundreds of thousands of students advertising a product that through 2 years ago was just a happy little product in the corner that people were using, and I could recommend it. And so again, sometimes if things get too good, then folks get
yep. And these things evolve with time.
Yeah.
But I'm interested right now. You mentioned that that Longsight is probably your biggest contributor.
Yes.
But there are many other contributors. How many developers working on Sakai now, roughly, order of magnitude?
Probably 20 people that put in 5 hours or more a week. Okay.
And how many?
Which is very efficient, which is amazingly efficient compared to any of the commercial vendors. It's amazing how far we've gotten with such a small team. And there's a reason for that.
Yep.
And that is, we don't have central administration, and we don't have central management, and no one gets yelled at. Everyone's happy. Everyone's working on things they want to work on. Everyone's in a good main state. And so we're just more efficient than a lot of other development organizations.
How many people working full-time?
Probably 6 or 7.
And do they all work for Longsight, or?
I think so.
Okay. Because my question was going to be, when you have people in a university who are contributing maybe 20 hours a week, that's a part-time job. Are they doing that out of the goodness of their heart, or is the university funding development? Do any of the practitioners fund? Yeah,
there's probably no one working at a university that's working more than 10 hours a week on Sakai at this point. In the phase 2, where Michigan, Stanford, Indiana, there were probably 4 to 5 full-time people coming from each of those universities.
Okay. Can we talk about usability? In the early days of Sakai was obviously a big concern, and that was kind of the flashpoint of the conflict between you and RSmart was, and it's a criticism. When I talk to some people I know in education, certainly that was the big early criticism of.
It's still a criticism. I mean, it's still a criticism.
So how has the project addressed that in terms of A, funding usability work and how that happened around the Sakai Foundation at the time, and B, on an ongoing basis? How do you have kind of designers and user experience contributors?
Yeah, so there's lots of things like that, like accessibility is another good example of something you might say. How do you get time, and how do you find time to work on accessibility? How do you find time to work on usability? And it's taken us a while to figure that out. So the first observation is that we don't lack for willingness on the part of our folks to invest in usability. And so if you said there's a usability project to do X, Y, Z, money would sort of start coming out of the woodwork. And so it's not that, because our customers see that as a priority, right? Because they have to kind of defend our product against all the billion-dollar products out there. And so if our product is short on some usability area, they are willing to, they could either, write a check for $1 million a year to a cloud vendor, or they could write a $100,000 check to get some usability stuff fixed in our thing. And so it's not for lack of money. The thing that we had to get past early on is people giving impassioned speeches about how important their lens is, and all the other lenses should go to hell. And then the problem is once you kind of go into this, my lens is got to be the winning lens, like usability's got to be the only lens, or performance has got to be the only lens, or accessibility's got to be the only lens, and my lens is the top lens, and all you other lenses, you live underneath me. We solve that by not saying any lens is the winning lens, and the one that tended to win in our mid phase tended to be technical people like me, because we represented resources that I could allocate my own resources. Right? If you tell me to work on X or Y or Z, and I want to work on Z, I'm going to work on Z, right? Because I'm a volunteer, and so I'm going to work on that. And so in the middle phase, a lot of the technical stuff got kind of won in an argument where there was kind of a trade-off. And there was like accessibility or usability tended not to win. But now what we have is we have different working groups, and there are different schools and commercial folks that show up at different things. There's like the core team, the technical team, the performance team, the usability team, the accessibility team, the QA